Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World, the podcast that celebrates the remarkable women of the Viking Age. From fierce warriors and powerful queens to wise seers and cunning goddesses, these women left an indelible mark on history. Join authors Johanna Wittenberg and K.S. Barton each month as we explore the stories, achievements, and impact of Norse women. Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World. This is episode 10, and it's a special one. It's our first interview. So in this episode, we are talking with author Patricia Bracewell. She writes the Emma of Normandy series. So I'm K.S. Barton. I'm the author of the Norse Family Trilogy, a story in which a young daughter of a Jarl and a Viking warrior are caught in a deadly blood feud between two families. And with me is Johanna Wittenberg. Hi, Johanna.
Hello, how are you doing, Kim?
I'm great.
Good. Well, I'm Johanna Wittenberg, author of the Norse Women series. It's the story of Queen Osa, who was a real Norse queen who ruled alone for 18 years in the early 9th century, the dawn of the Viking Age. And with us today is Patricia Bracewell. She's the author of a trilogy of historical novels based on the life of the 11th century Queen of England, Emma of Normandy. Patricia's books, Shadow on the Crown, The Price of Blood, and The Steel Beneath the Silk, tell Emma's riveting tale. She was twice crowned Queen of England during a tumultuous time when the country was under a near constant siege by Viking armies. Patricia is currently working on her fourth historical novel about Emma. And we invited Patricia to be on Women of the Norse World because in many ways, Emma was the quintessential Norse woman. She was of Viking heritage on both sides, with a Danish mother and a Norman father. And remember, Normans were Vikings originally, descended from Rollo. And Emma was also the queen of Canute, who was a Viking king, as well as the mother to his children and heirs. Like many Norse women, Emma knew how to take power and willed it within the bounds of society. Patricia Bracewell's research into Emma's and the lives of other women during her time is extensive and fascinating. So come with us on a deep dive into the lives of women in the 11th century. So hi,
Patricia.
Hello, ladies, Johanna and Kim. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm so honored to be your first guest.
Yeah, we're so glad to have you.
Yes, we are. It's very exciting. So tell us who Emma was and what was it about her that made you want to write 3, now 4 books about her?
Well, Emma was a fascinating figure in 11th century English history. She was the Queen of England, more or less, for about 50 years. She was the consort to 2 kings, one of whom was English, one who was Danish, and her husbands were mortal enemies, and that really piqued my interest. How did that come about? As you mentioned, she was the only woman who has been crowned Queen of England twice. She was the mother of 2 kings of England. She was the stepmother of 2 kings of England. She was the daughter of the Duke of Normandy, and she had a lot of relations in Normandy. Her brother was also the Duke of Normandy. She was the great aunt of William the Conqueror, and she was the reason he had a claim to the English throne that led to all that stuff that happened in 1066. One of the most interesting things about Emma, I think, is that she commissioned a book. It's called today the Encomium Emma Regina. She did not write it, but she was the force behind it and probably gave the writer a lot of information. And it described events that Emma lived throughout her life. But that book ignored the 15 years of her first marriage to the English king, Ethelred the Unready. And what I wanted to do in my trilogy was to write about what Emma didn't tell us. I wanted to explore her relationship with that first husband and the things that happened during that time. And also I wanted to really look at the events that led to that second marriage to Canute, the Danish king of England and Denmark and Norway, and his basically a big empire. So I felt I needed to divide it into 3 books because I had a lot to say. The first book is Shadow on the Crown, and that covers the years 1002 to 1005, when Emma is a young queen. She's married to a haunted, brutal king, Ethelred. She has to navigate the schemes of a noble court that is fractured by her very arrival. And also it's fractured by the constant threat of Viking attacks that took place throughout the time that she was married to Ethelred. The second book is The Price of Blood, and that covers the years 1006 to 1012. And now that's about an older Emma. She's in a crumbling kingdom, and she has to forge alliances. She has a son now. She has to forge alliances with nobles and prelates in England to protect her young son from ambitious men and from the attacking Vikings. The third book is The Steel Beneath the Silk, and that covers the years 1012 to 1017. And now the Viking conquest of England is reaching its climax, and the queen is forced to make decisions, really tough decisions, that are going to impact her life, her children's lives, and the future of England, as we know now. I know that's a mouthful.
It sure is. But you did a fantastic job of portraying all that intrigue in your books. I mean,
thank you.
Yeah, they were great. One word you mentioned just now that struck me and that I hadn't really thought about it before was that Canute had an empire. I'd never really, you forget that with the Vikings because they were off doing all these different things and raiding different places. But in some, especially with the Danelaw in England, they really did have an empire, especially when they were Denmark and England and Norway. And there was like southern Sweden was also a part of Denmark. And Iceland was a part of Norway. So some of them really did have an empire.
That's right. That's right. And he was quite a significant player, even in European politics at the time. People don't realize that. But his uncle was the King of Poland.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I didn't know that either.
So, yeah. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, about his visits to Rome.
And one thing I loved about the trilogy is that as a writer was the arc of Emma going from this young woman who's married to this man she doesn't want to marry. She's taken away from her home and everything she knows, and she's married to this brutal man, and yet she doesn't crumble under that. She manages to figure out her place, how she can protect herself and her kids and the people she loves, and wield her own power, like you said, in her own sphere, and really affect English politics till the end. I love the steel beneath the silk, which is such a great title to explain what Emma was like.
And the title was taken from a comment in the book that was made by one of Ethelred's sons, who's looking at her. She's standing there next to the king, and someone says she looks like a wraith, and Athelstan says, the king's son says, don't be fooled. There's steel beneath all of that silk. And that's all my titles have been pulled out of the story itself.
I love
So
that.
she was kind of the originator of that saying.
Yeah, exactly.
So now that we're talking about Emma, can you tell us a little more about Emma herself?
Yes. Emma, of course, grew up in Normandy. She was one of 9 children. I think she was the youngest, but we really can't be certain because, as you know, when women were born, and even in those days, in many cases, even when male children were born, their births were not recorded. So we don't know what year she was born. We don't know what year Canute was born. We can't be certain when Ethelred was born. These people just suddenly appear in the charters. So I think she was the youngest, and in my books, she's the youngest. And Emma would have seen her mother, whose name was Gunnar, assume the role of advisor to her husband, the Duke of Normandy. And then when the Duke died and his son, Richard II, became Duke of Normandy, her mother would have been his advisor too throughout his reign. So she saw her mother using female agency, using power. And I think she probably learned a lot from watching her mother She was raised to be royal. She was raised to be a woman with agency and a certain amount of power. Now, when she married Ethelred, she acted as peace weaver between England and Normandy. So there was an alliance that was made between the English and the Normans, and Emma was sent over to England to marry the king to sort of seal that alliance. And you know, from the stories that we have through Beowulf and some of the other Norse sagas, that peace weavers did not have an easy time of it. And Emma did not have an easy time of it, but she must, as you pointed out, Kim, she must have been strong-willed to be the young wife of a much older king, because Ethelred had already been on the throne for 23 years when she married him. He already had 10 children. Oh. She bore him 3 more children who lived to adulthood. She may have had more children. We don't know. In those 15 years, we don't know if when a woman has a miscarriage or when a baby dies very, very young and they don't appear at court ever. So there's another possibility, and I utilize that in my novels. She would have been instrumental late in Ethelred's reign in arranging the family's exile to Normandy. They had to run because the Vikings finally took over, and they could not stay in England. So where were they going to go? They went to Normandy. They went to Emma's brother. And she must have been instrumental in arranging that. She actually went first before the king went. So, try to imagine what that was like, hi, bro, I have to bring my entire family and perhaps about 50 people from the court to live over in Normandy. So there would have been a lot of logistics to deal with that. How much did they take? Who did they take? How long would they be there? They wouldn't know the answer to that. They weren't there for all that long, but they couldn't know that when they went first. They were venturing into the unknown. And so Emma would have been responsible to organizing a lot of that. And then after Ethelred dies and his son Edmund dies, Emma is married to the Viking conqueror of England, Canute. And now she's married to a man who's younger than she is. He's a Viking warrior. Again, she's got to be pretty tough cookie to be able to cope with this guy. She gives him 2 more children. She probably spoke Danish because her mother spoke Danish. And that would have been an advantage for her. And Canute would have seen it as an advantage too. So that was pretty lucky for her that she had that background. And we really think that Emma was a polyglot, that she probably spoke English, Norman French, could read Latin, spoke Danish, may have known Flemish, which is Old Flemish was not all that different from Norman French. So she was a polyglot. And we think that because that, in the end, towards the end of her life, the court that she was part of spoke all those languages. It was a real conglomerate of languages. Anyway, that second marriage essentially disinherited the sons by her first husband, Ethelred. And they went to Normandy. And in a way, that has tarnished Emma's reputation because she becomes queen again. She's crowned again. She keeps her lands and her wealth. She's the wealthiest woman in England. And it appears that she's abandoned her sons. She's just sent them off to Normandy and said, so long, and I'll have 2 children now by my new husband. One of the first mentions I ever saw of Emma was that she burned the candle at both ends, that it was pretty raw, even in the 11th century, to marry one guy and then marry his absolute mortal enemy afterwards. But the reality, which I'm sure you know from your research, is that a woman in a conquered realm was a pawn in the Game of Thrones. And that's basically what Emma was. Another example about her reputation is that even now, a recent podcaster described her as more ruthless and more unscrupulous than the men around her. Well, and you can imagine how unscrupulous they were. And he based that on an 11th century story in the Chronicle of Thietmar, German writer, Thietmar von Meersburg. And Thietmar says that when London was under siege by Canute in 1016, Emma was in London and she wanted to get out. So she made a bargain with him that she would turn her sons over to him to be executed in exchange for her freedom. And that really makes Emma sound pretty cold-hearted and not motherly at all. The thing is that the names were all garbled. He got the names of her sons wrong. One of the sons that he names was the son of Ethelred, who was already dead. And her own sons were safely in Normandy already with their uncle. So although it isn't true, it made a really juicy story for Thietmar about an ambitious and powerful queen. And that tells us something about how powerful and renowned Emma was at that time, that they were telling these kinds of stories about her. None of Thietmar's story, though, takes into account what Emma actually faced at that time when England was lost to a Viking conqueror. And she was probably a captive with little choice about what was going to happen to her. And in a way, in my books, I wanted to give her the opportunity. I wanted to show what she actually faced, to kind of clear the record for her and to show not only how powerful she was, but as a woman in a conquered country, how vulnerable she was. So I tried to show that in that final book.
Yeah, you did a great job of that.
Yeah,
well, and it's so funny that these chroniclers always do that with these powerful women in the Middle Ages, as if they were so much more ruthless than the men. Like, how many of these kings would give over people's sons and their sons as hostages, and then they would go off and break the deal, not even caring that their sons were hostages somewhere? I mean, it happened all the time. That makes me, that gets me kind of crazy sometimes when I'm like, these women.
And it's so great that we're actually able to now clear those records and tell the truth as near as we can get to it.
Well, part of it too is that, a lot of these powerful women were acting like men, and the men didn't like that.
Right.
They didn't.
It's still true.
Yes.
I'm sorry, in some cases. So yeah, we're always up against it, aren't we? Yes. But it was worse then.
Yeah, much worse.
But I like it what you do, how you give her agency. Well, she was a captive. I mean, she is a woman in a conquered place, and it was a captive, but she still manages to come out on top by using her own wits. And she was, at least how you portrayed her, she was very intelligent, very clever, had a really good mind for politics and that kind of thing. Like, I'm not going to let this get the best of me. I'm going to make the best of this situation. I appreciated that.
I think she actually was very smart.
Yeah.
And even the historians and scholars who talk her down,
reviled her.
Thank you. They recognized that she was canny. She was smart. She was politically savvy. When she married Canute, she knew where all the bodies were buried in England. And so she was a real advantage to him. And it was a reason why he wanted to marry her, because she could not just act as peace weaver, which is how I think she thought of herself, as peace weaver all her life in both marriages, but also as someone who could advise him and counsel him and do what her mother did for her husband and her son. And so we see Emma acting in that way because Canute came in, right? He speaks Danish, and he didn't make a lot of changes in England. And I think that Emma was responsible for that. It wasn't like when William the Conqueror came in, he just got rid of everybody and started over. Canute did not do that. He kept a lot of what was already there and built on it. And I think he got advice from Emma to do that.
Well, and that was the traditional role of the wife and the queen in Scandinavia, was the advisor, the wise queen, consult your wise queen. That was what was often the advice. And so you're right, women were raised traditionally in the Scandinavian society to be that way. And I totally agree that I'm sure it was Emma's mother that taught her that. And Canute was raised in a society like that. So he then just naturally expected Emma to offer her wisdom.
Exactly.
So women were much more valued at that time than they were a little bit later when things were written down about them. And the church was constantly working to portray women as intelligent. Women were evil. They were witches. These were not seemly virtues for women.
And I always find that so odd, because the whole, the Virgin Mary, that whole, she's sort of important at that time. And in fact, when you see, I didn't say this, but there are two drawings of Emma that we have that are contemporary. And in one of them, she's portrayed almost looking like the Virgin Mary. She's underneath the Virgin Mary, standing next to a cross, and Knut's on the other side of the cross. So Mary was quite honored as Queen of Heaven. And so Emma could build on that. And so it's just odd to me that later on, the religious prelates, the ecclesiastics, downplayed that aspect of women.
They did everything they could to reverse it. And it was, they really did. And also to revile women and to, claim them as inferior beings. And that was not too much later. And it's interesting, because I really think the early church had no choice but to have a very powerful female figure in their pantheon, which was Mary, in order for the people to accept that religion. But they gradually, over the centuries, eroded that power.
Right. Basically wrote them out of history.
Yep, exactly. And outlawed women's agency in many ways too. But that was not the case earlier on. And so Emma came from a heritage where women were valued much more than they were a little bit later. And that was, the pre-Norman, because it was Francia that adopted the Roman culture that did not value women. So that's kind of getting off in the weeds a little bit, but are there other examples of tales set in that same period that you were forced to untangle in order to use them?
Untangle is a good word for what I'm going to tell you. I'm working on one now, and it's about Thorkel the Tall, who's one of the characters in my novels, and he was a very important figure in history, a very important figure to Knut. He was Knut's basically his right-hand man when he first, back in 1016, 1017, and the early 1020s. He was the strongest of Knut's earls in England, and was his regent when Knut had to leave the country. But in the year 1021, Knut exiled him from England. He was outlawed. And we don't know why. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle just says he was outlawed. And so that left it to scholars to try to figure out what happened. But I found, well, I didn't find it. I found an essay by a scholar who discovered a story in the Ramsey Chronicle. And Ramsey is, the abbey is near East Anglia. And in that chronicle, it was claimed that Thorkel and his wife were tried for witchcraft. And Thorkel swore by his beard that they were innocent, and then his beard fell off.
Ooh.
Now, I wanted to use that witchcraft trial. I wanted that to be the reason why Thorkel was outlawed, so that 2 years later, which actually happened, Knut could then go to Denmark and take one of his sons and turn him over to Thorkel and say, be my son's foster father. And I couldn't see that happening if Thorkel had tried to kill Knut, or if he tried to do something really underhanded. But the idea of him using witchcraft for something, I thought might work really well. So I'm playing with that in the book. Another story that's a little bit more believable than having someone's beard fall off is that Knut had a daughter who drowned in the mill race at Bosham Church. Bosham is down on the southern coast of England. The church is there, and there is the grave of a young girl near the altar, which is where you would expect a king's daughter to be buried, as the important people were buried as close to the altar as you could get. But the girl's age, and they've looked at her bones and figured out roughly her age, that indicates that she could not have been the daughter of Knut and Emma. So whose daughter was she? If she was Knut's, who was the mom? So in my books, I've made her Knut's daughter by his first wife. Did I mention he had a first wife? His concubine. He was married to her before he married Emma in 1017. So I made this girl Elfgifu's daughter. Her name was Elfgifu of Northampton. And it also meant that I had to introduce Knut to his concubine, Elfgifu, several years before scholars think it happened. But because nobody actually knows when they met, I felt pretty safe doing that. And I didn't want Knut to have another relationship. He would have been really too young to do something like that. So I just kept him with the two women. I really hated to drown his daughter, but, I had to do it because it happened. Or at least the story says that it happened. So that's how I used that story. And that happens in my fourth book.
I'm looking forward to that one.
Me too. I like that you mentioned that, he had a first wife and then she had, another husband. It's a good reminder that life was short in this time period, and that people didn't stay married for like 50. Well, a lot of people didn't stay married for like 50 years or something like that, a wife might die and a husband would need a wife, he would need a wife or however it would work out, but they would often have 2 or 3 spouses in the course of a life or something like that, and children from different marriages, children from mistresses and things like that. And at least in the Viking world, it was a little less stigmatized to have a child out of wedlock than it was in the Christian world. So, well, before the Vikings were all Christian, but so it was pretty much just like, well, if he accepted this child as his, it was his, and there wasn't a whole lot of fuss. But it's a good reminder that there were a lot of marriages.
Charlemagne had 5 wives.
Charlemagne
had 5
wow.
wives.
Wow. So they must have also lived in a constant state of bereavement. They must have looked at it a little differently than we do because of all the infant mortality and the child mortality and then the spouse mortality. I mean, it touched lives much more strongly than it does ours.
Exactly. That's very true. And especially, when you look at widowhood, one of the things that Knut put into one of his first sets of laws was that a widow could remain a widow and not remarry for a year. So you can imagine you have these Danes coming over, and a lot of the women, noble women in particular, lost husbands in those Viking wars. So you had a lot of widows who were running estates, and you had men coming over who were looking for wives. And Knut made that law that they couldn't remarry for a year to give them some breathing space. You have to wonder. But there would have been a lot of widows in England in those years, a lot.
Widowed property owners, as you state.
Yes.
Yes. It's pretty progressive of Knut. Because didn't William the Conqueror just go in and take all those Anglo-Saxon women and just like dole them out to his followers and his men?
He did. Yeah. And, because so many of them were gone after Hastings, everybody was gone.
Could you imagine? I just can't even. I mean, I try as a writer to imagine what life would have been like, but I just can't imagine being a woman, a wife, a mother, and like your husband and maybe your sons go off to fight against this invading army and they all die, and then you're just given off to somebody else. Ugh.
Well, and some of them don't die too. They're horribly injured. You have to imagine how many men couldn't work, couldn't fight again, they would be incapacitated, right? Mm-hmm. Coming back. I mean, they've got a skeleton up at Jorvik that has, he all these wounds on his body that he suffered, and they healed, and then and then he died from a different battle later. So there would have been a lot of war wounded in England, in Denmark.
It was just a way of life for them.
It was a way of life. And I sometimes think the women in Denmark, when their men left, every time you went on a boat, it had to be a life-threatening experience, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Can you imagine being in the North Sea in an open boat? No, thank you.
Well, and to imagine or to even, go back and think, oh, well, these women weren't strong or whatever. I mean, they were strong in so many different ways. Even if they never picked up a weapon, they were just so incredibly strong to go through what they had to do. We talked in the November episode about healers and midwives and things, women who were out traveling or working, and they would just stop and have their babies and then just continue on. I mean, if that's not amazing fortitude, I don't know what is. But
well, physical labor was a way of life for everyone. And so those women were in incredibly good shape. They were physically strong. They weren't dainty little shrinking violets as they had later in the Middle Ages, high Middle Ages. This is the early Middle Ages. And, even royalty had to be strong physically and probably trained in weapons use. I know in Scandinavia, boys and girls both engaged in sports when they were young. So most women probably did grow up knowing how to handle a weapon.
And the emotional fortitude. I mean, like we were saying, it's got to be off the charts. Just being able to get up every day.
Yeah.
Go through life.
Yes.
Have you ever thought that you'd like to go back and just, as I've been writing my books, I thought I would love to just be able to go back and see what it was really like, but only for a day, because I don't think I'd last any longer than a day.
I don't think I'd last 5 minutes. So I would only want to go back in a spectral state so that I could see, but not actually physically materialize in that world, because just the germs that are different than what we have would probably kill you in the first 5 minutes.
Oh, we might kill them.
We might kill them. Yeah,
that's for sure. Yeah.
So I'll stick with the astral body.
I like that idea.
I would love to. I often think, if I could only see that.
Yeah, or smell it or taste it. I would do it if I knew I wouldn't get hurt or sick or die. I could do it.
But there would be a price. There would be a price.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about the smells, Kim.
Well, yeah, that's one of the reasons, that whole adage with writers, go get all the 5 senses. And I told somebody once, I'm like, do you really want to know what it smells like?
Sometimes you need to spare the reader.
I think they would have gotten used to those smells. That was just how things smelled.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's funny because when we were in Victoria a few weeks ago, we walked by, they have, the horse-drawn carriages, and we walked by the horses, and they were doing their normal thing. And my friend was covering her nose, and I was like, it smells just like my grandpa's barn. So, it's all a cultural thing. To me, horse poop does not smell bad, but to her, it was horrific.
Yeah, exactly. I've had that similar experience.
Well, while we're on the topic of the medieval world, so Patricia, can you tell us about the world Emma lived in, like particularly from a woman's perspective? Like, what was it like in Normandy, Anglo-Saxon England, Denmark? Like, can you give us a taste of that?
Yes, and I'm sure you can help me a little bit with this too. We've been talking sort of around it a little bit, haven't we? In Denmark, my understanding of Denmark at that time is that it had few urban centers during this period. It wasn't as built up as, say, London and England and Normandy. In Normandy, you had Rouen, which was a huge trading center. And of course, Normandy had the advantage of being accessible from a lot of different places, from England, France, the Low Countries. So there was a lot of trade going on, and they would have learn a lot from other cultures. So there would have been a lot of cultural exchange there. England was the wealthiest of the 3 realms that we're talking about. It was the most wealthy kingdom in Europe at the time. And it was why, of course, the Vikings were always going over there to get whatever they could. There were more similarities about these places, really, though, than differences. For example, there was no peace in any of these places. It was a place that was full of conflict, all of them. It was a man's world, and it was a violent world. In Normandy, the lords were starting to build castles because the nobles were jockeying against each other and fighting each other to expand their estates, their holdings. In England, you've had decades of Viking attacks coming over. So in England, they started building burhs, starting with Alfred the Great, and then through his son and daughter, and well into Ethelred's reign. Ethelred spent a lot of time fortifying those burhs that had been begun. And what happened with the burh was the Vikings would come, people would find out about it, and they would run to the burh with their children and their goods and their cows and sheep, whatever they could, and hide behind these walls of the burh. And eventually, particularly during Ethelred's time, those burhs became marketplaces. So now we have towns that are huge marketplaces. In Denmark, Christianity was just starting to take hold. A lot of the building in Denmark was wood, not stone. You see stone churches in England. You see a lot of stone happening in Normandy. And after 1066, of course, they brought stone over from Normandy to build a lot of the castles and churches there. Now, female rule, and we've talked about that, at this particular time was not really accepted by any of these realms. A woman's agency came through her marriage or in widowhood through her sons. So that is how a woman was able to get agency, not on her own because daddy was a king, but because she was married to someone who was powerful. And she could get, as Emma did, she made links with powerful people. The Christian concept, as one of you was pointing out, I think it was Kim, of one royal wife was only loosely observed in all these realms. Marriage was a political act. The ruler's motivation was alliance. So a wife could be set aside if another alliance was necessary. And we see that. That's why Canute set aside his first wife and married Emma. But a ruler might have a wife and a concubine at the same time. The concubine might not be set too far aside. She might still be hanging in the rafters somewhere. So this was true for Emma's father. He had a wife and a concubine. When his wife died, he married his concubine. It was true for Sweyn Forkbeard. And of course, it was true for Canute. In all cases, though, while the men were off fighting somewhere, it was left to the women to hold down the fort, whether that was a kingdom, an estate, or a farm. So you see women having to take control, take the reins of rule. They would have to make decisions about if there was a legal issue. Even if you were just a woman who had her own estate, you would have to keep the peace, keep the law, whatever that law was. You would have to be in charge of the men who protected the estate. So they would have to be ready to give orders. Meantime, they're the ones that are doing all the childbirth, right? Taking care of the children, the teaching. And childbirth, of course, was always perilous, no matter where you lived, no matter how old you were, it was perilous. One interesting thing about these realms is that in England, we were talking about this, the queen was the king's intimate royal counselor. Now, Johanna, you were talking about how women in Scandinavia counseled their men and gave them advice, but we don't really see a queen in Scandinavia doing that in this period. We don't see it in ducal Normandy after Emma's mother dies. So it's Emma was important. Ethelred's mother, who was queen before Emma, she was doing the same kind of thing. She was in charge, mostly because her son was young when he came to the throne. Ethelred was only about 10. So it's only in England that we see the queen being in that role of intimate advisor to the body of the king. So, pillow talk maybe is going on, telling him what he should be thinking about, what he should be doing, warning him maybe of what's going on or what she knows through her contacts that he doesn't know through his. So that's one difference.
Yeah, and we see the erosion of women's power during that time period.
Well, I wonder, before we were recording, when we were talking about Tyra in Denmark, that she was the wife of Gorm the Old and the mother of Harold Bluetooth. And, the rune stones that have so much about her, I wonder if she was maybe one of those queens that we just don't know anything about her, but she might have been like that. She seems
Absolutely.
it seems like she was a really powerful queen. We
I think
don't
so.
know anything anymore.
And they said in the thing that we all looked at in that clip that the theory is that maybe Gorm wasn't Danish, that maybe he came from outside Denmark and he married her, and it was through her that he was able to be king. That it was that they had a queen and then she married him and made him king. And that's what started the whole lineage that Margaret of Denmark now is a descendant of Thera and Gorm and Knut and Svein and the whole gang.
It's possible, although they didn't really have, Denmark wasn't a nation yet.
No, it wasn't. She would have been a queen of something. Some area.
And he may have been from another area, but there weren't really, as Kim mentioned earlier, part of Sweden, part of Norway, part of Denmark. They were all one kingdom at various times during history. The Danes were constantly expanding. And even back in the time of the 9th century, when I'm writing, the Danes did own property in Norway. I mean, they were, but nobody knows exactly what and where. But it is mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle during King Alfred's time, and also in the Frankish Annals, that they had property in Norway. The Danes did. And also the name Dane is often applied to any Viking.
That's right. Well, and of course, the groups of Vikings were different too, because you had some mostly from Denmark coming over to Eastern England and Southern England, but the Norse went northern through the Shetlands and over to Ireland. So, and of course, when Sven attacked England, he took anybody that he could get from anywhere. So they were quite a motley crew.
They were.
And then the Swedes went down into the continent, where Russia and Ukraine and down along that way.
Through the Baltic, that way, east.
One thing
their languages were very similar.
I was just about to mention language. Yeah.
They could speak to each other. And even English wasn't that far off. The Anglo-Saxon English had a lot in common with the Scandinavian languages.
That's right.
Yeah, I think we need to remember, well, maybe not us, but that Anglo-Saxon English, we would not be able to understand it now. It's not English like we know it.
Yes.
No, old English is I'm always amazed that there are people in America who can speak Old English.
It's kind of cool to listen to.
I went to a talk once, and he got up there and started speaking in Old English. I thought, oh my God, let me out. I don't understand a word he's saying.
It's a foreign language.
Yeah.
Well, and speaking of that, why don't you tell us some more about your research journey, Patricia, the challenges that you faced and all the methods and sources you had to use?
Happy to do that. I began with a broad overview. God, looking back on it now, I can't even hardly remember. I looked at the 11th century history, what was going on in that world. And especially I started with Normandy, and then I went to England, looked at English history, because I had to convince myself that I could discover enough about that world in order to recreate it in my novels. I was not a history major. I was an English major. So I didn't have that advantage of that historical viewpoint that I think a lot of historical novelists do have. This was in the early 2000s, and it was before the whole Viking thing took off because of Bernard Cornwell's wonderful books about Uhtred and the Last Kingdom. And I was halfway through the writing of my first novel when I really understood how much I didn't know. And that scared the heck out of me.
We've been there.
Yeah.
So I decided I needed to go to England. And the first thing I did was I discovered that there was going to be a 2-week course at Cambridge in England on, and there was a class called Kings, Queens, and Vikings. And it was going to cover the period from Alfred the Great to Edward the Confessor, which is exactly what I wanted. So I signed up for that. I was accepted. And my husband and I went over to England before the Cambridge class started. We started out in Canterbury and spent some time there. We went over to Normandy, to Rouen, and spent several days in Rouen, and went to Fécamp, which is where I set the opening scenes of my first novel at Fécamp. And we went to Exeter. We followed the route that I imagined Emma would take if she went from Winchester to Exeter on this particular scene that I wanted to create, this particular chapter that I wanted to have her do. I wanted to have her go to her lands because she owned properties in Exeter. That was her dower lands, was the whole town of Exeter was hers. So I wanted to put her there. So we followed a route that I guessed she might have taken. And then after that, I went to Cambridge for that program. And through that program, we made a trip to the ship burial at Sutton Hoo. We went to the British Museum. I went on my own to the Westow Anglo-Saxon village. And that was all one trip. That was my first research trip. And then we took numerous later trips. We went back to England, to London. We went to York. We went to Copenhagen so I could see Roskilde. We went back to England to attend the Battle of Hastings one year, a recreation of that. And that was really interesting. And then I was given a research grant at Gladstone's library in Wales. And I spent 2 weeks in Wales researching at that library there. That was an amazing experience. But most of my research was done in the stacks at UC Berkeley Library, which is about a mile from where I live. And so I was there looking at the journals, which have so much information, more information than you can find in any, say, a book about the Normans or the book about the Anglo-Saxons. They're just journals that are, that cover an entire shelf of papers that people have written, scholars have written about the period. So lots of notes that I took there. And what were my challenges, aside from trying to understand that world, was trying to understand what it looked like. And I know you've gone through this too. We've just been talking about how we wish we could go back. What were the royal estates like? How were they set out? What were the towns like? What was the King's Hall made of? Was it stone or was it made of wood? What were their clothes like? How did they dress? What did they call the clothes that they wore? How did they travel? How long did it take to get from place to place by horse, by wagon, by ship? How long did it take in an army? How long did it take a small group of men traveling? Trying to figure all that out. And I attended for 8 years in a row the International Congress on Medieval Studies in Kalamazoo. Did you ever go to that?
No, never even heard of it.
Oh my God. There are people, scholars and PhD candidates and professors and students who come from all over the world, and they talk about the Middle Ages. They talk about the music, they talk about the writing, they talk about the history. It's just an amazing conglomeration of, and then they have a mead tasting, which is the most popular thing. So I went there, and it allowed me to meet scholars, to have lunch with them, to have dinner with them, and ask questions, and to talk about their books that they're writing, scholarly books, talk about my books. And of course, I always came home with more books to read because they had a huge book sale there. The other challenge that I had that was a big thing once I'd gotten through all of that other stuff was, what the heck was Emma doing during those years when I was trying to write about her, when there were Viking armies attacking over and over? And she is mentioned only 3 times in the major historical work about that period that was contemporary, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So over those 15 years, her name is mentioned 3 times. Wow. That's it. She was probably not sitting around weaving all day. So I had to figure out, what was she doing? That was my biggest challenge, I really think. I'm still trying to figure that one out.
Well, I think it shows you did all that research in your books.
Oh, thank you.
Well, then how did you fill in all those blanks?
Yeah. Next question. Well, I started with the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and that was written contemporaneously or within 100 years of Ethelred's reign. Mostly we're talking about Ethelred's reign during this time. And I use that for my template and for my timeline. So I looked at the things that the Chronicle said happened, and I imagined how Emma would respond to the events that were recorded in those documents. When she first arrives in England, we know she arrives. The Chronicle said in that year, Emma, the daughter of Richard, came to England. Thanks for all that information. That's all it says. Who comes with her? What does she face when she first arrives in England? I had to think about how she got along with her stepchildren, all 10 of them. How did she get along with her husband? What was he like? And I had to do research on him to find out what he was like. And we have some theories about that. How did she react when at one point his life was threatened and he responds by ordering the massacre of all the Danes in England? And remember, Emma's mother was Danish. So how is she going to respond to that? So that's where the fiction comes in, because it's based on Emma's response that we don't know to events that actually took place that we do know. I also looked at, of course, Pauline Stafford is an amazing historian, and she has written numerous essays about this period and a biography of Emma. And she describes the wedding of Emma's great aunt. And she describes how this woman brought gifts, horses laden with showy harness, a crowd of servants, and chests filled with silk clothing worked in gold. And I figured, well, that's stuff that Emma would have too. So that's what Emma brings with her to England, stuff that she takes with her when she has to flee to Normandy. And I used it too when Knut is wooing her in my third book. The gifts that he gives her to woo her, I pulled from the stuff that Pauline Stafford talked about in her book. I also included elements from the lives of other women in Anglo-Saxon history that I could find out about. So, for example, in the 9th century, you have the French princess Judith marries the King of Wessex. She's crowned in France. She's much younger than he is. She goes back to England with him. He's the King of Wessex, not of all England. So this is many years before Ethelred, and when England was all united under Ethelred's father, Edgar. So when her husband, the King of Wessex, died, she married his son. Now, that would have been a no-no as far as the church was concerned, but it happened. And that gave me an idea. It gave me the idea of having Emma fall in love with her stepson, who's Ethelred's oldest son, Athelstan. And that gave me a love interest for my story and a very compelling subplot that goes throughout the novel and helps me add to the conflict in the story between Ethelred and his sons, partly because of how he treats Emma. Yeah, that's how I filled in the blanks.
I really liked the love subplot. Well, because I like love stories, but I also liked, because he was closer in age to her, like how it kind of humanized the whole thing. She's not just some pawn. She's this young woman who's thrown into this marriage. What did you say? He's 23 years. Athelstan was 23 years older than Emma.
No, Ethelred was 23 years older.
Yeah, that's what I meant. I meant Ethelred. Yeah. So it makes sense that she would be attracted to somebody closer to her age who is actually, and treating her better. So I like that addition. It really made her, that conflict of being a young woman forced to marry somebody she didn't want to marry. So.
Thank you. And I think, when we read history, the characters, the figures in history come off as almost like stick figures, like they didn't have any, especially when you go this far back in time, like they didn't have any feelings. They didn't care about their children. They didn't care, they're not fleshed out. And I think that is the job of the historical novelist, to flesh out those people and imagine what they went through. So that's what we all try to do, right? All three of us are trying to do that, to look at those people as people, not as stick figures.
Right.
And also the similarities and differences between modern people and those people, and that's where you really have to stretch your imagination to make them relatable, but yet still people who lived in their times.
Yes. And that's hard to do.
It is.
I think that's really hard to do, to put ourselves back into that world.
It really is.
Tough.
So I know you're working on a fourth book in the series, and I'm really excited about it. So can you tell us about that? Give us a little preview.
Well, I'm only 9 chapters in.
That's substantial.
I have a long way to go. I feel like I'm standing at the bottom of an Alp looking up.
Yeah. We can relate.
You know what that's like.
Yes.
So this fourth book is going to be different than the others, because the others all were only covered about 4 or 5 years, each one. This one is going to cover about 25 years.
Wow.
And it begins with Emma's role as Canut's queen. And it also introduces the children who are going to grow up over these 25 years and play significant roles in the history of Normandy and England and Denmark, and certainly in Emma's life at that time. So as Canut's queen, Emma did not experience a lot of conflict. When I wrote my first books and I could look at the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and it talked about all this stuff happening in England that Emma could respond to, in the years that she's married to Canut, England is at peace. There's no horrible thing going on that she has to respond to. All the action is happening offshore. It's happening in Denmark. It's happening in Norway. It's even happening in Normandy. And so that gives me some issues that I have to deal with. Where do I find the conflict for Emma if she's stuck at home? So we do know that Canut traveled to Rome in the year 1026, and he went to the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor at that time. And at that time, he arranged for the marriage of his daughter by Emma, her name was Gunhild, to be married. They were betrothed. They were too young to marry yet, but they were betrothed. Gunhild was betrothed to Henry, who was the son of the Holy Roman Emperor. So that was a big thing. Not only was he hanging out with the Pope in Rome, he was going to the coronation and taking part in the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor and arranging his daughter's marriage. So what was Emma doing? One of my readers sent me a photo of something from a sign at St. Bartholomew's Church in Otford. And the sign says that the church's name came from a relic of St. Bartholomew that was donated by Emma after her pilgrimage to Rome. And it has the year as 1020. This is the first time I saw any mention that Emma might have gone to Rome. Did they get the date wrong? Did they mean 1026 and not 1020? So I'm toying with the idea of sending Emma to Rome with Canut. She may have stayed behind when he was doing all his warring in Denmark and Norway and in the lowlands, but she, as his regent, I could do that. But they don't talk about anything happening there. So I may send her to Rome because I think that would be pretty interesting. And if I was Emma and he had it in his mind to, betroth my daughter to somebody, I would want to know who these people were. and also, it would be really fun to go to a coronation. So I'm thinking about that. Now, eventually, Canut's going to die. And as his widow, Emma's life reads really like a thriller. Canut's concubine, Elgifu, up in the north, she promotes her son, Harold, as Canut's heir because he would have been Canut's eldest living son at the time, older than Emma's son, Harthacnut, who Emma promotes as King of England, Canut's heir. But Harthacnut is over in Denmark. He's already king there, and he's fighting off armies from Norway, and he can't get away to come to England and take the throne, take the helm at England. So the Witan, which is the wise men of England, they get together in Oxford and they say, okay, Harold, you rule for Harthacnut in the north, and Emma, you rule for Harthacnut in the south. But Harold wasn't about to buy that. And this lasted for a couple of years until finally he decided to take the throne. Oh, wait, I forgot something important. At the same time, Emma's two sons by her first husband over in Normandy, they decide to come to England.
Oh my goodness, the plot thickens.
Yes. What was in their minds, we don't know. We have to figure that out. But they would have been in their middle, late 20s. You know, they knew that mom was over there. This Canute, the bad guy who had kicked him out of England, he's gone. So what are they going to do?
They wanted a piece of the pie.
Yeah, they would want a piece of the pie. So they come over to England. And the real question is, did Emma invite them? There is a letter saying she invited them. And she said, no, I didn't write that letter. Anyway, they came. One of them got beaten in a battle right on the shore and turned back. The other one was murdered by Emma's stepson, Harold, Canute's son, Harold. So, yeah, there's a lot going on. And Emma has to flee. She has to leave England. She goes not to Normandy, because Normandy was a mess by that time. She went to Flanders, and she lived there for a couple of years. Meantime, while she's there, her daughter goes with her husband, Henry, into Italy from Germany, and there's a plague there and disaster happens. So there's a lot of stuff that I can play with in that novel. I really don't know what I'm going to do with all of it. I'm thinking, I'm looking, I'm planning, I'm plotting. And the only thing that I know for sure is the book's very last sentence. And I'm not going to tell you what it is.
Oh, it sounds like you have enough information for more than just one book there.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot, especially if you take Emma to Rome. That could be a whole book.
Yeah,
that's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it too.
I bet you're looking forward to being done with it, because that's a monumental project.
Well, yeah, and when I finished the trilogy, thought, okay, I'm done. No. I did what I set out to do. Emma's married to Canute, happily ever after, da-da-da-da-da. And people are coming back and saying, well, she lived a lot longer. What's the rest of the story?
Yeah. You've already done all the research.
People who know about Emma know how thrilling that last part is, and complicated and dire in a lot of ways. So we'll see. I decided to write it. We'll see if I get to the end or not.
I'm sure you will. I'm sure you will too, given time. But I am looking forward to it so much.
Thank you.
I'm in a book club, and one of the women in the group with me, she said something once about like, oh, this ending feels rushed or whatever. And I said, you know what? When you're writing a book, when you get to the end, you kind of want it to just finish. You want to be done with it. I'm like, we try not to rush it, but I was like, and she was like, really? And I'm like, yeah.
Well, and I've been living with these people for 23 years now, since I started this project.
True. Well, you've done all the research though, so it kind of seems fitting to just keep going in that same.
Yeah, you've certainly laid the groundwork.
Period. Yeah.
It's important to have that kind of support, encouragement, going while my husband's playing golf.
So where's the fun in that?
How old was Emma when she died?
Well, we don't know when she was born.
Oh, right.
I can tell you that she died in the year 1052. So she would have been in her 60s, possibly in her 70s. We know that her son Edward lived quite a long life. He was in his late 60s, I think, when he died. Canute's children did not live long. And they think that there was maybe some sort of physical genetic issue. His sons by Elfgifu died in their early 20s. His son by Emma died in her early 20s. Her daughter by Emma died Emma survived she had 5 children, and 2 of them outlived her. Only 2.
Wow.
Edward the Confessor and her daughter by Ethelred Godiva. So she had the longevity gene, not Canute. And Ethelred had the longevity. Although Ethelred lived into almost his 60s, into his 50s, but his dad died when he was 30 something. But most of those royals in that time died in their beds. They didn't die in battle. Ethelred died.
Did they die of poison? That's another question.
Poison is an issue. And of course, anybody that died suddenly, Emma's son Harthacnut died suddenly. He died at a wedding feast. So there's a question of, was something poisoned that he was drinking? But the reality is you could die of so many things at that time that they didn't know about.
Wasn't it King Stephen whose son died from like eels that were like an eel pie that was bad or something?
Yeah,
like that?
Food poisoning. Food poisoning had to be a major killer because no refrigeration, no real good way of storing or preserving food.
Yeah, and water would have been an issue.
Yes.
Yeah, there were a lot of things that could go wrong. I killed off one of Emma's stepsons with appendicitis.
Oh,
sure.
There would be nothing they could do, and it would be a horrible death.
Yeah.
Yes.
And of course, women died in childbirth all the time.
Yep.
So happily, I have a pathologist who lives down the street from me, and every time I want to kill someone off, I call him up.
That's very handy.
Well, anything else to add?
We could probably go on for another hour if we really
Good.
But we really covered a lot.
We did.
And I thank you so much, Pat. It was so great to have you here to hear all about Emma and all about your extensive research. Very inspiring.
Mm-hmm.
It's been such a pleasure to talk with you every time that we've talked in the past too. And I enjoy your podcast, and I'll be promoting it on my newsletter. So
thank you.
Great. Well, I hope you'll give us a peek at your new book at some point.
Oh, yeah. Maybe we could be advanced readers.
Yeah, that would be lovely.
That's a thought.
Yeah.
That's a thought. Okay.
Thank you. So, and next month, Johanna and I will be talking about Anglo-Saxon women, some other Anglo-Saxon women. So we thought we'd piggyback on our little journey over to England and dig into that. So that'll be fun.
That sounds fascinating.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it was good talking to you both.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good talking to you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. You can find Johanna at johannawittenberg.com, where you'll find a free short story, a prequel to her Norse Queen series. And you can find me, K.S., at ksbarton.com, where you can also find a free short story from me, a prequel to my Norse family series. See you next time.